The morning of September 17, 1943, broke cold and grey over the Soviet airfield at Smolensk. Lieutenant Alexei Mikhailovich Volkov stood beside his fighter, running his hand along the patched fuselage, feeling every rivet, every hastily welded seam beneath his calloused fingers. The aircraft was a Polikarpov I-16, a stubby, outdated fighter that the younger pilots called the Ishak, the donkey. But they had other names for it too, names they whispered when they thought Volkov couldn't hear. Flying Coffin, Death Trap, Widowmaker. The I-16 had been obsolete even before the war started, designed in the early 1930s when biplanes still ruled the skies. Now, in the third year of the Great Patriotic War, it was a relic, a desperate measure for a nation that had lost thousands of modern fighters in the early months of the German invasion. Volkov was 32 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards. Most of the boys in his squadron were barely 20, fresh-faced kids who looked at him with a mixture of respect and pity. They flew the newer Yak-9s and LA-5s when they were available, sleek machines that could almost match the German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Almost. But there were never enough of them, never enough of anything except determination and the bitter cold that seeped into your bones even in September. Volkov had been flying the I-16 since before the war, back when he was an instructor, teaching young men how to handle an aircraft that wanted to kill them almost as much as the enemy did. The I-16 was fast in a dive, incredibly maneuverable, but it was also unstable, unforgiving, and built like a sardine can with wings. One good burst from a German 20mm cannon, and you were done. The mechanics had worked through the night again. Volkov could see the exhaustion in their oil-stained faces as they made final checks on the aircraft. His plane bore the scars of 2 years of combat, patches upon patches, replacement parts cannibalized from wrecks, an engine that had been rebuilt so many times that Volkov sometimes wondered if a single original component remained. The paint was worn away in places, showing bare metal beneath, and the squadron insignia, a red star within a white circle, was barely visible anymore. But the guns worked. That was all that mattered. 4 Shkaz machine guns, 2 in the wings, and 2 synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. Not as heavy as the German armament, not by a long shot, but in the right hands, enough. Captain Dmitry Sokolov approached, his boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. He was the squadron commander, a man who had somehow survived since the first day of the invasion, June 22, 1941. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, eyes that seemed to focus on something far beyond the visible horizon. "Alexei," he said, his voice rough from too many cigarettes and not enough sleep. "We have a problem." Volkov turned from his aircraft, waiting. Problems were nothing new. Intelligence reports a major German fighter sweep coming our way. They're escorting bombers heading for the rail junction at Orsha. We need to stop them. Volkov nodded. This was the daily reality, the endless cycle of interceptions, dogfights, and desperate attempts to protect the ground forces and supply lines that kept the Red Army fighting. "How many?" Volkov asked. Sokolov's expression darkened. "At least 30 fighters, maybe more. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "There's more. Intelligence believes there are several Experten among them." The word hung in the cold air. Experten, the German term for their ace pilots, men with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of kills. The Luftwaffe had a practice of keeping their best pilots in combat, flying them mission after mission, building their scores to astronomical numbers. These were not just skilled pilots, but killers who had perfected their craft over years of war, from Spain to Poland to France to the vast skies of the Eastern Front. "We have 8 serviceable aircraft," Sokolov continued, 3 Yak-9s, 2 LA-5s, 2 I-16s, and 1 barely functional MiG-3. He looked at Volkov's patched fighter. "I'm not going to order you to fly that thing against Focke-Wulf's, Alexei. You've done enough. Take one of the Yaks. Let Petrov take the I-16. Lieutenant Petrov was 19, eager, and in Volkov's estimation, not quite ready for what was coming. None of them were, really, but Petrov especially. He had only 12 missions under his belt. "Petrov doesn't know the Ishak well enough," Volkov said quietly. "She's temperamental, needs someone who understands her moods." Sokolov's jaw tightened. You're not indestructible, Alexei. That aircraft has no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. One hit and you burn. Volkov smiled thinly. One hit and any of us burn, Dmitri. The difference is I know exactly what this aircraft can do. I know her limits, and I know how to use what she has. It wasn't bravado. Volkov had long ago moved past bravado, past fear, past almost everything except a cold, professional understanding of aerial combat. The I-16 was inferior to the German fighters in almost every measurable way. It was slower in level flight, its guns were lighter, its construction more fragile. But it could turn inside anything the Germans had. In the hands of a pilot who knew what he was doing, who could exploit that single advantage, it was still dangerous. Sokolov studied him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. All right, but stay close to the formation. Don't go chasing glory. The briefing was short. They would climb to 5,000 meters and position themselves between the German formation and Orsha. The bombers were the priority, but the German fighters would have to be dealt with first. Standard tactics, assuming anything about aerial combat, could be called standard. As Volkov walked back to his I-16, he found young Petrov waiting by the aircraft, his face a mixture of disappointment and relief. "Sir, the captain said I should fly the MiG today." The boy couldn't quite meet Volkov's eyes. He had been looking forward to flying the nimble I-16, but he had also heard the rumors, the statistics. Of the last 10 pilots assigned to fly I-16s in their squadron, only 2 were still alive. "The MiG is a good aircraft," Volkov said, not unkindly. "Faster than this old girl. You'll do fine." Petrov nodded, but then he said, "Sir, is it true what they say? About you in Spain?" Volkov paused in his pre-flight inspection. Spain. That seemed like a lifetime ago, another world. He had been 26, a volunteer flying with the Republican forces against Franco's nationalists and their German and Italian allies. He had flown I-16s even then, against the Messerschmitt 109s in their first combat trials. "Some of it," he said finally. "Most stories get bigger in the telling. They say you shot down 7 Germans in 2 weeks. They say you once flew your I-16 through a hangar to escape a Messerschmitt on your tail." Volkov allowed himself a brief smile. "The hangar story is true. The doors were open on both ends. Mostly. And I shot down 5, not 7. 2 were Italians." Petrov's eyes widened. The story was true. He started to say something else, but the sound of engines firing up around the airfield cut him off. It was time. Volkov climbed into the cramped cockpit of his I-16, the familiar smell of oil and cordite and old leather enveloping him. The cockpit was tiny, designed for smaller men than him, and he had to hunch his shoulders to fit. The instruments were basic, some of them not even working anymore. The radio crackled with static more often than voices. But his hands moved automatically through the startup sequence, every switch and lever memorized through thousands of hours of flight time. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, the whole aircraft shaking with barely contained violence. The M62 radial engine was powerful for its size, but it was also old, worn, held together by the skill of mechanics who performed miracles with almost no spare parts. Volkov let it warm up, watching the oil pressure gauge climb slowly into the green. Around him, the other fighters were starting up, the newer aircraft with their smoother, more refined engines, and beside him, Sergeant Kozlov in the other I-16, a veteran almost as old as Volkov himself. Kozlov gave him a thumbs up through the canopy. Volkov returned the gesture. The takeoff was rough, as always with the I-16. The aircraft wanted to torque to the left from the powerful engine, and the narrow landing gear made it unstable on the ground. But once the wheels left the earth, the Ishak came alive. This was her element, the sky, where her stubbiness became agility and her small size became an advantage. Volkov pulled back on the stick, and the fighter clawed for altitude, the engine screaming. The formation assembled slowly, the 8 Soviet fighters circling to gain altitude. Volkov took his position on the left flank, with Kozlov on the right. The Yaks and Lars took the center and upper positions, their better performance allowing them to maintain energy advantage. As they climbed through 3,000 meters, Sokolov's voice came over the radio, distorted but understandable. "Keep your eyes open. Intelligence says the Germans have been using new tactics, coming out of the sun in coordinated attacks. The sun. That old tactical advantage, as old as aerial combat itself. Volkov squinted upward, scanning the brilliant blue sky above them. At 4,000 meters, his fingers were going numb despite his gloves. The I-16 had no heating system, and the cockpit canopy, which he had slid back for better visibility, let in the frigid slipstream. Around 5,000 meters, they leveled off, throttling back to conserve fuel. The I-16 was not known for its range. Volkov had perhaps 40 minutes of combat time before he would need to return to base. He scanned the sky constantly, a habit drilled into him over years of combat. Most pilots who died never saw what killed them. The Germans excelled at the ambush, the sudden diving attack from altitude advantage. The Luftwaffe pilots called it boom and zoom, diving at high speed, firing a quick burst, then using their speed to climb back to safety before the Soviet fighters could react. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, contacts, 11 o'clock high, many aircraft. It was Lieutenant Burov in one of the Yak-9s, his voice tight with adrenaline. Volkov's eyes snapped to the indicated position. At first, he saw nothing, then small specks against the blue, difficult to distinguish. But they were there, and they were many. As the formations closed, the specks resolved into aircraft. Junkers 88 bombers in a tight box formation, and above them, much higher, the fighter escort. Volkov counted quickly, at least 20 fighters, possibly more. The odds were not good. They never were. All aircraft, this is Red Leader. Sokolov's voice was steady, professional. Yak and La flights will engage the fighters. I-16 flight, your target is the bombers. Break formation on my mark. It was the right call. The faster, more modern Soviet fighters had a chance against the German escorts. The I-16s would be slaughtered in a turning fight with Fokker-Wulfs or trying to chase Messerschmitts. But against the bombers, slow and relatively unmaneuver-able, they could be effective, if they could survive long enough to reach them. Mark, break, break, break. The formation scattered. Volkov pushed the stick forward and to the left, diving away from the main group, with Kozlov following. The two I-16s dropped like stones, gaining speed, the altimeters unwinding rapidly. 4,500 meters, 4,000, 3,500. The bomber formation was now at their altitude and closing fast. Behind and above them, the sky erupted into chaos. The German fighters had spotted the Soviet formation and were diving to engage. Volkov caught glimpses of aircraft wheeling, tracer rounds stitching the sky, black smoke. He forced himself to ignore it. His mission was the bombers, trust the others to do their job. The Junkers 88s were in a formation of 12 aircraft, flying in 3 groups of 4. Their defensive guns would create a crossfire that could be deadly, but they had blind spots. Every aircraft had blind spots. Volkov aimed for the rear element of the formation, planning his approach to minimize his exposure to defensive fire. At 1,000 meters, the gunners spotted him. Tracers began reaching out, bright streaks that seemed lazy until you remembered they were moving at nearly 1,000 meters per second. Volkov jinked left, then right, small movements, not wasting energy. At 500 meters, he selected his target, the bomber on the far left of the rear element. His thumb moved to the firing button on the control stick. At 300 meters, he pressed it. The 4 Shkayas machine guns erupted, their combined rate of fire nearly 60 rounds per second. The noise was tremendous, even over the engine roar. The I-16 shuddered with the recoil. Volkov walked his fire across the bomber's left engine and wing root, seeing pieces fly off, sparks, then smoke. He held the trigger down for 3 seconds, then released and pulled back hard on the stick, the I-16 responding instantly, pulling up and over the bomber formation. G-forces crushed him into his seat. His vision began to grey at the edges. The aircraft groaned, metal stress competing with engine noise. Then he was through, rolling inverted to look back. His target was streaming smoke, but still flying. Damn! The machine gun rounds were too light. He needed another pass, but there was no time. Achtung! Fighters above! It was Kozlov's voice, the veteran's hard-earned instincts screaming a warning. Volkov rolled the I-16 upright and looked up. Three Messerschmitt 109s were diving on their position, the sun glinting off their canopies. They had broken through the Soviet fighter screen and were hunting the attackers, threatening their bombers. This was the moment of truth. The Messerschmitt 109, Gustav, was faster, better armed, more modern in every way. But speed in a dive was not the same as maneuverability. Volkov did exactly what the German pilots would not expect. Instead of running, trying to escape, he turned into them, pulling the I-16 into a tight climbing turn to the left. The Ishak's incredible roll rate and turn performance came into play. The aircraft practically pivoted in the sky. The lead Messerschmitt opened fire, but Volkov was already inside his turning circle. The tracer rounds passed behind him, deadly but ineffective. The German pilot tried to follow, pulling his aircraft into a turn to track his target. But the 109, for all its virtues, could not turn with an I-16 flown by an expert. Volkov completed his turn and found himself for just a moment behind and slightly below the German fighter. It was a position every fighter pilot dreamed of. His thumb found the firing button. The range was close, less than 100 meters. He pressed the trigger and felt the I-16 shudder. His tracers reached out and stitched a line across the Messerschmitt's fuselage. He saw pieces fly off, saw the canopy shatter. The 109 snap-rolled to the right, trailing smoke, and dove away. No time to watch. The other two Messerschmitts were adjusting, recognizing the threat. But now Kozlov was in the fight, his I-16 latching onto the tail of one of them. The German pilot, realizing his danger, broke hard right, trying to use his speed to extend away from the slow Soviet fighter. It was the right tactic, but Kozlov anticipated it and led his shot perfectly. A long burst, and the Messerschmitt's engine began streaming white coolant smoke. An engine hit. The German would not make it home. The third Messerschmitt pilot, finding himself suddenly outnumbered and his wingman hit, made the sensible decision and disengaged, diving away at full throttle. The I-16s could not catch him. Volkov didn't try. His fuel was already running low, and there were still bombers to deal with. But when he looked back toward the bomber formation, he saw they had scattered their tight formation, losing cohesion under the attack. Two were trailing smoke, one was losing altitude rapidly, and the rest were turning back toward German-held territory. Mission accomplished, at least partially. All red aircraft, this is Red Leader, reform on me. Sokolov's voice came through, but it was strained. The radio frequency was filled with chatter, some of it panicked, some of it too calm, the calm of men who knew they were dying. Volkov scanned the sky, trying to make sense of the swirling dogfight that was still raging above. He spotted a Yak-9 in a flat spin, trailing fire. No parachute. He saw a Focke-Wulf and a LA-5 locked in a scissors maneuver, each trying to get behind the other. And higher up, much higher, he saw something that made his blood run cold. 4 aircraft in a perfect finger-4 formation, diving from 8,000 meters. They were Focke-Wulf 190s, and they were moving with a precision and coordination that marked them as experts. These were not ordinary Luftwaffe pilots. These were the Experten, the aces, and they were coming down like wolves on a wounded flock. All aircraft, fighters high, 4 bandits, 8,000 meters, diving. Volkov's warning went out, but he knew it might be too late. The Germans had altitude, speed, and position. They would make one pass, firing, killing, then climbing back to safety before anyone could react. It was textbook boom and zoom, and it was devastatingly effective. Volkov watched them come, his mind racing. The I-16 could not climb to intercept them. It could not outrun them. But maybe, just maybe, it could surprise them. The German pilots would be focused on the bigger threats, the Yaks and Lars. They might not pay attention to the obsolete I-16s, might dismiss them as not worth the ammunition. That was a mistake Volkov intended to exploit. He pushed the throttle to maximum and pointed the nose of his I-16 at the sky, climbing as steeply as the aircraft would allow. The engine screamed in protest. The airspeed dropped dangerously low. The I-16 began to shake, threatening to stall, but Volkov held it, balanced on the knife edge between flying and falling. The German formation split, each pilot selecting a target. Volkov saw one Focke-Wulf line up on Sokolov's Yak-9. The range closed with frightening speed, 1,000 meters, 800, 600. The German pilot was good, Very good, leading his target perfectly, compensating for deflection. At 400 meters, he opened fire. The Focke-Wulf's guns were devastating, 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. The Yak-9 shuddered under the impact, pieces flying off. Sokolov tried to brake, but it was too late. The Yak's engine exploded and the aircraft began to tumble. Volkov saw the canopy jettison and Sokolov's parachute deploy. One down. But Sokolov was alive. The Focke-Wulf that had shot him down was now climbing back to altitude, using the speed from its dive. It passed within 300 meters of Volkov's position, the German pilot probably not even registering the small, obsolete Soviet fighter struggling for altitude. But Volkov saw him. And more importantly, Volkov saw the tactical situation with perfect clarity. The German had used his speed to climb, but in doing so, he had bled off that speed. He was now slow, relatively speaking, and completely focused on regaining altitude, not on checking his 6 o'clock. It was the mistake that killed pilots, regardless of skill. Volkov pushed the stick forward and rolled the I-16 inverted, pulling into a split S maneuver. The world spun, sky becoming ground, ground becoming sky. He pulled through the bottom of the maneuver, the G-forces crushing him again, and came out heading directly toward the climbing Focke-Wulf, but from below and behind. The angle was nearly perfect. The German pilot was a dark silhouette in the canopy, clearly visible. Volkov closed to 150 meters, dangerously close, close enough to see the individual panels of the German aircraft's construction. His thumb pressed the firing button. All 4 machine guns fired. At this range, even the light rifle caliber rounds were effective. He walked his fire up the Focke-Wulf's belly, across the cockpit and into the engine. He saw his tracers impacting, saw pieces of cowling fly off. The German aircraft's canopy suddenly misted red. The Focke-Wulf snap-rolled left and went into a vertical dive. It did not recover. Volkov watched it all the way down until it impacted the ground 4,000 meters below, a bright flash followed by a pillar of black smoke. 2. But the fight was far from over. The other 3 Focke-Wulfs had completed their attacks and were climbing back to altitude. One of the LA-5s was going down, streaming fire. The MiG-3, Petrov's aircraft, was missing its entire tail section, tumbling toward the earth. Volkov felt a cold anger settle over him. Petrov had been just a boy. The remaining Soviet fighters were scattered, disorganized, low on ammunition and fuel. The smart thing to do would be to disengage, return to base, live to fight another day. But Volkov had been fighting this war too long to always do the smart thing. The German aces were regrouping, reforming their finger four formation. They were confident, professional, and utterly deadly. Volkov could see it in the way they flew, the precise spacing, the constant cross-checking of positions. These were men who had survived hundreds of combat missions through skill and teamwork. He keyed his radio. "Kozlov, are you still with me?" "Da, Comrade Lieutenant. I'm on your right, low." Volkov glanced over and saw the other I-16, battered but still flying. "We're going after them." There was a pause. Then Kozlov's voice, matter of fact. "All 4? "All 4. Another pause. "It's a good day to make the fascists pay." It was possibly a good day to die, but neither of them said that. The 2 I-16s began to climb again, painfully slowly, like old men climbing a steep hill. The Focke-Wulfs were at 6,000 meters, circling, probably deciding whether to make another pass or call it a day. Volkov hoped they would stay. He needed them to stay. At 5,000 meters, one of the German pilots spotted the 2 I-16s climbing toward them. Volkov saw the Focke-Wulf waggle its wings, signaling to the others. The formation began to turn toward them. Good, they were coming. 4 against 2, the Germans in superior aircraft, with altitude advantage. To the German pilots, it must have seemed like target practice. They were about to learn differently. The Germans split into 2 pairs, classic rotor tactics. 2 would attack from the left, 2 from the right, dividing the Soviet fighters' attention. It was good tactics against normal opponents. "Kozlov, take the right pair. I'll take the left." "Understood." The formations closed. Volkov could see the Focke-Wulfs clearly now, their distinctive radial engines, the wide wings. the predatory look of true killing machines. At 1,000 meters, the Germans opened fire, long-range shots intended to unnerve and possibly score a lucky hit. Volkov ignored them, maintaining his course, conserving ammunition. At 600 meters, he broke hard left, throwing the I-16 into a turn so tight that the wings groaned and the aircraft shuddered on the edge of a stall. The two Focke-Wulfs tried to follow, but once again they could not match the turn radius. Volkov completed a full 360-degree turn in the time it took the Germans to turn 180 degrees. As he came around, he found himself perfectly positioned on the tail of the wingman of the left pair. The German pilot realized his danger and tried to extend, pushing his throttle forward, diving to build speed. But he was too late. Volkov had the angle and the timing. He fired a 3-second burst. The range was less than 200 meters. He saw his rounds impact the Focke-Wulf's left wing, tearing through the aileron and into the fuel tanks. The wing erupted in flames. The German pilot jettisoned his canopy and bailed out immediately, his parachute blossoming white against the blue sky. 3. The leader of that pair, seeing his wingman go down, reversed hard, trying to bring his guns to bear on Volkov. But the I-16 was already turning inside him, the two aircraft locked in a horizontal scissors, each trying to reduce the turn radius to get behind the other. It was a test of skill, nerve, and aircraft performance. The Focke-Wulf had more power, more speed, better guns. The I-16 had one thing: it could turn tighter. Volkov pulled the stick back into his stomach, horsing the little fighter around in a turn that would have torn the wings off most aircraft. The G-forces were crushing. His vision tunneled, the edges going black. He was on the edge of blacking out, but he held it, held the turn, trusting his body to endure. The German pilot was good, very good, but he could not match the turn. For just a moment, Volkov's nose came around and pointed at the Focke-Wulf. He fired. It was a deflection shot, difficult, the kind of shot that missed 99 times out of 100. But this was the 100th time. His tracers arced across the sky and intersected with the German aircraft. He saw impacts on the fuselage, on the canopy. The Focke-Wulf's nose dropped suddenly, the aircraft going into a dive. Volkov tried to follow, but his airspeed was too low, the I-16 mushing through the air. He couldn't tell if the German was hit badly or just diving away to disengage. Then he saw the Focke-Wulf pull out of the dive 2,000 meters below and level off. The aircraft was smoking, but still flying. Damn, another few rounds and he would have had him. Volkov's ammunition counter was almost at 0. He had maybe 5 seconds of firing time left. He looked around for Kozlov and found him half a kilometer away, locked in combat with the other two Focke-Wulfs. Even as Volkov watched, he saw Kozlov's I-16 stagger under a hail of cannon fire. Pieces flew off the wing. The aircraft began to trail smoke. "Kozlov, break off, get out of there." But Kozlov didn't respond. His I-16 rolled inverted and went into a spin. Volkov watched helplessly as the spin steepened, as the altimeter unwound. 1,000 meters, 800, 500. At 300 meters, a parachute deployed. Kozlov had gotten out. Barely. That left Volkov alone, at 5,000 meters, nearly out of ammunition and fuel, facing two Focke-Wulf 190s flown by Expert 10. The rational part of his mind said to run, to dive away, to use what little fuel he had left to make it back to Soviet lines. But the cold anger that had settled over him earlier had grown into something else, something harder and darker. These German pilots, these aces with their kill markings and their Knight's crosses, they thought they owned the sky. They thought that their superior aircraft and their superior training made them invincible. Volkov intended to teach them differently. The two Focke-Wulfs were climbing back to his altitude, reforming. They knew they had him. One obsolete fighter, low on everything, against two of the best pilots in the Luftwaffe. They were probably already thinking about how this kill would add to their scores, how they would paint another small Soviet star on their aircraft's fuselage. Volkov did something unexpected. Instead of running or defensive maneuvering, he turned toward them, climbing slightly, heading directly into their formation. It was insane. It was also the last thing they would expect. The Germans hesitated for just a moment, probably trying to figure out what the Soviet pilot was doing. That moment was enough. Volkov fired his remaining ammunition in one long, desperate burst, hosing the sky between the two Focke-Wulfs. He didn't aim at either aircraft specifically, he just filled the air with lead, creating a curtain of fire that they would have to fly through. The lead Focke-Wulf jinked left, the wingman right, breaking their formation. It was a small thing, but it was an opening. Volkov went after the wingman, the I-16 rolling inverted and pulling down in a split S. His ammunition was gone, his guns empty, but the German pilot didn't know that. The Focke-Wulf pilot, seeing the Soviet fighter coming at him, broke hard right, a defensive maneuver. It was the right move, but it cost him energy and altitude. Volkov followed, not firing because he couldn't, but staying glued to the German's tail, maintaining the appearance of an attack. The German dove, pulling away with his superior speed. Volkov let him go, pulling out of his dive at 3,000 meters. His fuel gauge was showing almost empty. He had maybe 5 minutes of flying time left. The last Focke-Wulf, the leader, was still up there at 5,000 meters circling. Volkov could see him clearly, could imagine the German pilot studying the situation, deciding his next move. Then the Focke-Wulf began to climb, not toward Volkov, but away, heading west, back toward German lines. He was disengaging. Volkov watched him go, feeling an odd mixture of relief and disappointment. The German pilot had made the professional decision. His wingmen were down, he was alone, and the Soviet fighter, obsolete as it was, had proven to be dangerous. Better to live and fight another day. Volkov turned his I-16 east, toward home, nursing his remaining fuel. The engine was running rough, the whole aircraft vibrating in a way that suggested something was damaged. Only now, with the adrenaline beginning to fade, did he realize he was shaking, his hands trembling on the control stick. The flight back seemed to take hours. Every meter he had to coax out of the dying engine was a small victory. He flew low, barely 100 meters above the ground, watching his fuel gauge hover at 0. The engine coughed once, twice. He spotted the airfield ahead, the cratered runway, the burned-out hangars, the tiny figures of people looking up. The engine coughed again and died. The propeller windmilled to a stop. Suddenly, the only sound was the wind rushing past the canopy. Volkov put the nose down, trading what little altitude he had for airspeed, setting up for a dead-stick landing. The I-16 was a glider now, and not a particularly good one. He cleared the airfield boundary by meters, the landing gear almost clipping the perimeter fence. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced, touched down again. With no engine power he couldn't correct. The I-16 slewed left, the landing gear collapsing on one side. The aircraft spun around once and stopped, sitting at an awkward angle in the middle of the runway. Volkov sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the control stick, unable to quite believe he was alive. Then he heard shouting, saw people running toward him. He unbuckled his harness and climbed out of the cockpit, his legs barely supporting him. Sokolov was there, limping, his flight suit torn and scorched from his bailout. "Alexei, we couldn't believe. How many?" Volkov's mind was still processing, still trying to make sense of what had happened. "4. I think 4. 2 confirmed, maybe 2 more damaged." Sokolov's eyes widened. "4? You shot down 4? The mechanics had reached them now, surrounding the broken I-16, already assessing the damage. One of them, a grizzled sergeant named Popov, whistled low. "Comrade Lieutenant, this aircraft should not be flying. Look at this." He pointed to a line of holes along the fuselage that Volkov hadn't even noticed. Cannon damage from a passing shot that had somehow missed anything vital. "You were flying on luck and spit." "I was flying on spite," Volkov said quietly. Word spread quickly. By evening, the story had traveled through the entire regiment. Lieutenant Alexei Mikhailovich Volkov, flying an obsolete I-16 that everyone called a flying coffin, had engaged multiple German aces and shot down 4 of them in a single day. Intelligence officers arrived to debrief him, listening with skepticism that turned to belief as they cross-referenced his claims with radio intercepts and ground observer reports. The Germans had indeed lost 4 pilots that day in that sector. One was a captain with 43 kills. Another was a lieutenant with 31. The other 2 were both aces with more than 10 kills each. They had been some of the best pilots in the Luftwaffe. They had flown the best fighters Germany could produce, and they had been shot down by a man in a fighter that was obsolete before the war even started. In the weeks that followed, the story grew, as stories do. Some said Volkov had shot down 5 or 6 or 10. Some said his I-16 was magical, blessed, invincible. The younger pilots stopped calling the I-16 a flying coffin, at least when Volkov was around. They started calling it the Volkov Special instead. But Volkov himself never spoke much about that day. When pressed, he would simply say that the aircraft didn't matter as much as people thought. A good pilot in a poor aircraft could still win against a poor pilot in a good aircraft. And sometimes, with luck and skill and a great deal of anger, a good pilot in a poor aircraft could even win against good pilots in good aircraft. The I-16 that Volkov flew that day never flew again. The damage was too extensive, the airframe too worn. It was stripped for parts, and the shell left beside the runway, a memorial of sorts. Volkov was assigned to a new Yak-9, a modern fighter with armor and firepower and all the things the I-16 lacked. He flew it well, as he flew everything well, and he survived the war with a total of 22 confirmed kills. But he never forgot that day in September 1943, when he and a patched-together fighter that everyone said was a death trap proved that sometimes the man matters more than the machine. Sometimes the obsolete can defeat the modern. Sometimes the underdog wins. Not through superior technology or numbers, but through skill, determination, and the refusal to accept that defeat is inevitable. The Eastern Front continued to grind on, consuming men and machines in numbers that would have been unthinkable before the war. The Luftwaffe would send more aces, more Experten, more of their best pilots. Many would die in the skies over Russia, shot down by Soviet pilots flying aircraft that were supposed to be inferior, fighting for a cause that gave them a strength that numbers alone could not measure. And somewhere in that vast sky, in the swirling dogfights and the desperate combats, Lieutenant Alexei Mikhailovich Volkov continued to fly, no longer in his rusty I-16, but carrying with him the lesson that aircraft had taught him, that the will to fight, the skill to execute, and the courage to face overwhelming odds could turn a flying coffin into a chariot of victory. The mechanics eventually placed a small plaque on the remains of Volkov's I-16 with a simple inscription, "She flew when she should have fallen, fought when she should have fled, and won when she should have lost." It was a fitting epitaph for an obsolete fighter. It was an even better description of the men who flew them.